Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to discuss some health resources and in particular in relation to emerging contexts of health communication. So these are all your new and emerging computers, devices, telehealth, all that stuff. And this is covered in chapter 9. We want to talk about these things and mostly their implication for communication. One of the bottom lines when it comes to what we refer to as computer-mediated communication is often that it's not really the tools that shape the behavior. It's more our nature in using tools and how that is expressed through the capabilities of the new tools. If that sounds confusing to you, don't worry. I'm going to try to make it simpler. But the tool use is the same. The tools are not. Let's see what we can, if we can make some sense out of that. Now, recall the changing landscape of health communication. Uh, Technology and globalization are major influences, and they're influencing culture, health, and society. And when it comes to, again, this developing our new communication tools and technology as we progress through time, what we're seeing more than anything is not necessarily totally new problems, but an accelerating of things. Things are happening much quicker, and they're happening quicker than they used to. And that is the main influence of technology that we see. Now, all the rest of the research and theories that we talk to is going to be exploring the implications of those kinds of ideas on the current health context because humans may not always be accustomed to the speed with which the tools allow us to actually interact and make decisions and gather information. So let's remember that the internet is still a relatively new phenomenon, eh, both in healthcare and just real life, out in the real world in general. I am old enough to have witnessed the internet revolution. I'm only 37. I was born in 1985, and the internet really became a thing in the mid 90s. I'm old enough to remember dial-up modems and the horrible screeching sounds and how long it takes to load any sort of web page and all of that. That was still within my lifetime. And you may think of me as quite a bit older than you, but really that's not that much time. And the span of 20 years, 30 years, we have revolutionized how we do every single thing in our lives. It probably goes without saying, but it always helps to stop and remember how profound a change that can actually be. Now, what this means, at least for our current context and historical context in society, is that there's a huge knowledge gap. There are people who are more internet savvy, people in your generation and below, and mine we grew up with technology. We grew up with the internet. We grew up with mobile devices for the most part. I didn't get my first smartphone until I was a grad student, but that was mostly because I was a curmudgeon and was resistant. But you get the idea here. My parents, your parents, grandparents, the people who came before, the older demographics are not as tech savvy as you are. And maybe that's a point of making memes and things like that. We need to recognize that that can lead to some real health disparities. Now, not only are there age-related health disparities, but you have other issues that influence this as well that we'll get into. But what we're talking about here at the bottom line is that there's a knowledge gap. So the internet provides access to all kinds of information, but the people who need that information the most, they're not necessarily getting it for a variety of reasons. The people who have more access already have a pretty good level of literacy, whether it's health or technology literacy. And so that can contribute to some problems. Now, communication technology is revolutionizing medicine, for better or worse. There are pros, there are cons, and there's not really a quick and simple explanation as to how that goes down and how we can avoid it. There are some tips that we can get into as well, though, and we'll try and do that a bit in this lecture. As with most things, there are both benefits and drawbacks. It's not like technology and smartphones are totally evil, nor are they our saving grace necessarily. It comes down to our behaviors and how we use these things. So we should work to pursue the benefits while minimizing the drawbacks. So the chapter is mostly concerned with eHealth, mHealth, and telehealth. What are those things? Well, these sound like fancy buzzwords. Well, they kind of are. Well, eHealth is an overarching category that describes the use of technology to promote good health, independent from For instance, geographic limitations or logistical limitations, or even temporal limitations. Think about how much this is speeding things up in the processes. mHealth is specifically referencing like mobile health. This is using mobile devices, Fitbits, things like that. Tablets even are into this category. Think about apps and their application. Health apps are probably the #1 manifestation of what we would refer to as mobile health or mHealth. So that's your Fitbits, that's your Apple Watches, and it's your sleep trackers and your, hey, you should manage your time better, and hey, you're having too many calories today, that kind of stuff. Telehealth is another category that refers to long distance healthcare in general. Probably predates all of the internet stuff, because before we really had all the current infrastructure with internet and smartphones, you know, telephones were still a thing, and so were teleconferencing and coordinating remotely. And so telehealth is used to describe long-distance healthcare, education, administrative teamwork, and also disaster response, both how we conceptualize these things and the infrastructure surrounding them. Now, one of the subsets here is telemedicine, which is specifically referring to clinical services. So if you've ever had a telehealth appointment, well, that probably falls into the category of telemedicine, where you're on a Zoom call with your doctor or something like that. We probably all have some feelings and opinions about those things, but let's make it more concrete and dig into what the research says about these different resources. So first, it's probably going to help us to think about some social influence and theories, communication theories, in terms of how people seek information. Because when we talk about eHealth and telehealth and all this, we're talking about volumes of information. We're talking about streamlining processes, and that means we're talking about human behaviors in relation to gathering information. So we're going down to a fairly fundamental level here and trying to observe how people use these technologies to gather information. Now again, going back to this idea of a knowledge gap, e-patients tend to be, according to the research and demographics, they tend to be young, they tend to be affluent, meaning that they are higher socioeconomic status, they tend to be educated, and interestingly, they also tend to be female. So those are the people that tend to use eHealth information the most, at least again, in terms of statistical trends. But that probably puts a pretty clear picture in your head as to what kind of people are and are not using eHealth. So the problem here is the knowledge gap that emerges. But the research that exists on these particular demographics and how e-patients use eHealth, it shows us that these individuals tend to simply just want more information. But they still prefer doctors as their primary source of information. So eHealth and telehealth and all that, it's not replacing doctors as the primary source of information. And we'll probably see that it probably shouldn't. But if we use it smartly, we can augment the experiences of a lot of people and potentially reduce health disparities. But again, for the fourth time in like 2 minutes, we want to consider that knowledge gap. The people who most need information are not likely to have access to it online. They may not even have access to the internet in general. mHealth might be changing that a little bit because more people in the world own smartphones than do computers. So that's changing as we go along, and we might skip over that whole people just using computers part in a lot of the world. But the fact remains that we're talking about technology. Technology costs money. It requires access. It requires internet access. And that means that you're going to have some strong correlations between people who are lacking in health literacy and access to and health information and their access to the internet or access to infrastructure. So when it comes to things like health equity or reducing health disparities, and that means health issues across different demographic groups, we're going to need to be trying to improve access. And so we can go all the way back to health equity for that. So for example, older adults, low socioeconomic status, and people with low educational levels are least likely to have internet access. And that means that they're going to be having some problems with what we would call health information efficacy, access, and all sorts of different things. And so we want to ask ourselves how we can promote health information efficacy. This has to do with health literacy. This has to do with technological literacy, and it has to do with a lot of different things. But in particular, we're going to start getting into some of these social influence theories and how people not only seek information, but how they're motivated to process it, if they're motivated to process it. And that has to do with their own perceived self-efficacy, whether or not they believe that they are able to find the information, they're able to process the information, and able to apply it in their own lives. So that confidence in finding and understanding health information is also a critical part of this. Let's dig into a couple of different cognitive theories or social influence theories that can maybe help us understand how, why, and how effectively people are processing and seeking health information. So the first theory that the textbook is introducing for us is called information sufficiency threshold. And this is coming from a pretty fundamental social influence theorists back in all the way starting back in the 1980s. This has to do with people's desire to find information, specifically how much information a person needs to cope with an issue, right? So you encounter an issue, be it health or something in your day-to-day life, and you feel uncertainty regarding that issue. Well, then you are going to pursue information until you feel like you've achieved that threshold that you are then able to help cope with that issue. So this is a motivational theory, recognizing that the more uncertainty we have in situations, the more motivated we are to find information. And you can extrapolate that idea up to a lot of what we've talked about before with health campaigns and ad campaigns or whatever it may be, in terms of, are we introducing uncertainty and providing an avenue for reducing that uncertainty, such as with a fear appeal. But essentially, when we're talking about uncertainty, we're talking about it in relation to motivation of achieving information in this context. In other contexts, we talked about this, such as in social support, in terms of how uncertainty can decrease your sense of agency and vice versa, right? If you have more agency, you can reduce your uncertainty. Not always, but often that is the case, and that can help us kind of recognize some of these mechanisms and perhaps even use them strategically when it comes to health communication. Another model that the textbook is introducing, and you'll notice that these are fairly old models because they're formative. They're seminal models, and a lot of the subsequent theories are based on these things, spanning up to recent stuff, right? So the health information acquisition model is a little more specific to health information. It describes some of the conditions under which individuals are likely to seek more health information, which can in turn inform us as to how eHealth is happening. So essentially, if a concern demands attention, if they don't feel well informed, it seems urgent to them, and they believe that they are able to find trustworthy information. This is probably the simplest way to think about how people acquire health information, but there are more factors involved than these, and we can see that in the subsequent literature. So let's dig in a little bit deeper and consider some more specific factors that are influencing our desire to process and seek health information. So essentially what we're asking ourselves is, how much do I know about this issue that has been arisen in my life or proposed to me, and what are the costs and benefits of seeking more information? I have used the example of some of the cancer survivors in the work group I'm in, the collaborative work group for breast cancer in Wisconsin. One of the things that the survivors mentioned is like, well, I went and got the screenings, and but that was about as much as I knew about breast cancer. And then once I actually was diagnosed with breast cancer, suddenly I realized how little I did know. And then I had to overcome barriers to get information. And so that assessment of the costs and benefits of seeking information, you may not think about it in those terms yourself, but on a subconscious level, we do. The cost may be just picking up your phone and Googling it, but if you're not comfortable with that, or that seems difficult to you, well, then you're going to be assessing other costs. How much does it cost to go see your doctor and ask them questions? How hard is it for you to find a support group? But at any rate, this has to do, again, with agency and self-efficacy as major factors of motivation in terms of behaviors of all kinds. And this is kind of another reinforcing relationship. We've discussed agency and uncertainty as kind of a dialectical tension, but we can see how a low self-efficacy, a low sense of agency can contribute to less health literacy, and again, kind of recursively reinforce that sense of helplessness, perhaps. So let's look at some other specific examples. We're moving up to the early 2000s here with the theory of motivated information management. And this is another additional consideration of that coping ability, which might govern our information seeking channels. So people thinking about how equipped they are to cope with a thing, and that is a motivation for them to seek more information. The integrative model of online health information seeking, this one is introducing some social considerations. So when we talked about health equity, well, this is probably the number, well, it's a primary theory that's explaining that in relation to online health information. So again, it's taking some of that those lessons from the critical research and saying that there are social structures and inequities influencing info-seeking behaviors. Not just access to information, but whether or not you're going to do it for other reasons, whether or not you feel hopeful about finding information. That, again, that self-agency. And for an example of this, you can remember the rather tragic example of the Tuskegee syphilis trials and things along those lines, which were performed in a poor black community. Right? And so, as just a brief reminder, the Tuskegee syphilis trials got a lot of people killed because it was really irresponsible and unethical research where they were telling people they were getting treatment for syphilis, but they really weren't treating people for syphilis. They were more watching the progression of the disease. Obviously, a breach of ethics and a breach of trust. But why I'm bringing this up again is that in relation to this kind of model is, well, that would be a social structure and inequity that is going to influence, in this example, Black Americans perhaps may have lower levels of trust for a healthcare official or authority. That's going to influence information seeking behaviors as well. If you have that violation of trust, then you're less likely to even seek out the opinion of those people. You probably don't need to think too hard about that to see how that could be true in other contexts. Another theory the textbook's bringing in, I know a lot of theories, right? But they're all interesting and useful in their own way. But anyway, here's another one, is the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology. You notice they're all a little bit different. Some of them are about technology, some of them are about social influence, some of them are about health communication specifically, and that's why the textbooks bring all these in, because not any one of them really captures everything that we're talking about. So this one is talking about social influence, performance expectancy, effort expectancy, facilitating conditions such as, are you going to be able to use the computer in a quiet environment or something? And also hedonic motivation. That has to do with, is it pleasurable to use the technology? So this theory is talking about technology use in general and whether or not people are likely to do that. So these are the major factors that research found. Now, we have italicized here, hedonic motivation seems to be the strongest predictor or motivator as to whether or not people will use technology. So that means if you think it's fun, if you get some pleasure out of using the device, you're more likely to use it. And that seems to have been, and this seems to be a mathematical approach here. When we say it predicts something strongly, well, that means when they measured something like, hey, do you think devices are fun? And then they score that as hedonic motivation. Mathematically, that was much more predictive than some of these other factors in terms of whether or not people were likely to use technology. Maybe that doesn't sound surprising to you, but hey, at least it's documented in the research. So another brief aside here regarding these different theories, as I mentioned, they all cover kind of different things. They don't all capture everything that we're looking for. The reason I think it's worth going through them in relative detail here for you is at least so you have another reference that you can come back to while you're trying to find more information about designing and implementing your own health communication programs for your final project. So it's always good to pull in theories like these, and you can say, hey, well, according to this theory, we really want to target agency and self-efficacy, or we really want to target hedonic motivation by making our app fun, right? Something like that. That's just a little pro tip there in terms of how to succeed on your final projects. Pulling in theories like these can help you justify the decisions that you make. Now, how useful is eHealth? How, like when we get down to it, there's pros and cons, and how useful really is it, in particular to patients. Let's start with that. Well, I just whipped up a little table for you so you can see some of the advantages and disadvantages. On the advantages side, we have a variety of information. We have a lot of richness in terms of the information available on the internet. It's more engaging, right? It could be more fun to read. Think about that hedonic motivation. It's practical. It's practical advice, and it's available 24/7. It's available immediately. Your doctor is not. So if you have a problem and you want to know before you start cooking something like, should I cook with this? Is that okay? Then you can Google that pretty quick. That's really convenient. It's also advantageous in the form of social support. We've talked extensively about the benefits and importance of social support in the last lecture, but we also want to recognize we'd be remiss not to recognize the role of technology in facilitating modern social support. It doesn't replace face-to-face interactions, but it does allow people to build social groups and social networks and those kinds of relationships. As we saw probably in the social support and other places, it really doesn't replace face-to-face interactions. And as you have experienced firsthand in the past 3 years, moving your life online is simply not the same. So you're probably better equipped than anyone to understand the limitations of things like eHealth. So here's some of the disadvantages. For one, as we are well familiar with when it comes to internet resources, it can be unreliable or even misleading. And not only are we talking about the quality of information, but again, going back to the beginning of the lecture, the technology allows this information to move very, very fast. If things go viral, then it doesn't really matter how accurate the information is anymore. If people share it, and there's layers and layers of sharing and clicking and that kind of stuff, that makes it all the more important for you and others to be prepared to do a little bit of research on your own. But we'll come back to that when we get to some tips for making eHealth most useful to you. Now, additionally, you can have conflicting information because there's so much information, so many sources, and so many, well, for lack of a better word, uninformed people making very strong opinions on the internet. You're going to get conflicting information. That can be more confusing. That can increase your uncertainty and actually reduce your agency, increasing anxiety and all that good stuff. There's also, of course, the overwhelming volume. Now, modern search engines and resources endeavor to limit that and help you process it and manage it. But again, remember this from the perspective of, say, your grandparents. They may not be super equipped to manage that sea of information. And additionally, there are privacy concerns. The patients in particular report this, right? If the less experience you have, or even if you have a lot of experience with these resources, you may be concerned about hackers. You may be concerned about ads. You may be worried about tracking software, and you probably should be because, frankly, this is the new Wild West, and this is a new resource to be tapped, and everyone is trying to leverage that to their advantage. That means there are hackers. There are people using your private data for trying to predict your behavior. That's a little spooky. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the mHealth. But I think all of these advantages and disadvantages raise a serious concern for us, and that is the importance of media and health literacy. If you've been paying attention this semester, I've been trying to give you tips along the way to help with research and processing information. Go back to the research and composition lecture if you want to refresh your memory about that. But even that amount of information I've given you is probably enough for you to improve your media and health literacy and circumvent a lot of these problems. But in case that's not enough, here's some more specific tips for internet resources and evaluating them and using them to your own benefit to minimize some of those disadvantages of eHealth. So for one thing, if we're looking at internet resources, be suspicious of anonymous materials, so things without authors. That's a pretty important red flag to be aware of. Be aware of people selling things. If they're selling you something, even if it's not like some weird folk remedy, just be suspicious of that as well, because there are plenty of free resources. There are plenty of credible free resources, because real health professionals are in it for a reason, and it's not just to sell you snake oil. Be aware of a lack of resources. If you're just reading some weird health blog and they're not referencing things, don't trust it. Simple as that. Outdated material. Health is changing all the time. We can always use the COVID example that this is something our understanding of evolves by the day. And so now three years on, things that are 2 years old might be outdated because we've learned so much in that time. But that applies to all kinds of things. The more recent, the more credible current your findings are, right? That's important. If we're getting good research from recent sources, you know that they have the current opinion. They may have discovered something that people did not know back in the 90s. Be aware again of miracle cures and secret formulas. Hey, spoiler alert, they don't exist, right? Medicine is hard work, health is hard work, and all of the miracle drugs that we know of are, pretty well leveraged. I mean, hey, ibuprofen is pretty miraculous, but it's not, ooh, this secret formula, doctors will hate it. Obviously, I feel like this goes without saying, but those kinds of miracle cures and secret formulas are usually a lot of BS. Satisfied customers. This one, the tip coming from the textbook, they're reminding you that this is more of a sampling issue. I mean, of course, half the time you see, trust this satisfied customer, right? Maybe they're an actor, but even if they aren't, one satisfied customer is not enough to help you assess the generalizability of claims, right? So that's a sampling thing in terms of like statistical issues, as well as a credibility thing. Things that you can do to help. You should do your own research. And again, I've helped you do enough, helped you have enough tips here that you don't even need to be an expert of methodology or anything like that. You have access to library resources. You have access to Google. You can assess credibility. And if you're looking at a place that is worth anything, they probably have hyperlinks to the studies. See if you can find those studies. 12% of the time you're going to click on those links and they're going to be dead links because a lot of people are disingenuous about those kinds of things, sadly. So now, do your own research. That's not as scary as it sounds. It helps improve your agency and reduce your uncertainty. I really hope that I've helped you figure this out a little bit. And this is, as a side note, the mocking people for doing their own research over the past couple of years, well, that's a problem, right? I think that it's important to do your own research, but doing your own research should not look like the things on the left here. That should not be just, oh, miracle cures. I'm reading about satisfied customers. That's not doing your own research. Doing your own research is going to find the original study and at least read the how current it is, read the abstract, read some commentary, read the discussion, whatever it may be. It doesn't take too much time, and it's going to really probably save you time, actually, because otherwise you're just going to be clicking around a whole bunch of contradictory health blogs that have no idea what they're talking about. Read the fine print on those websites. See what kind of conflicts of interest people have. See what other kind of caveats and addendums are hiding in there. Just, pay attention to what you're doing. Heck, read the labels, of medicine. Just pay attention, right? Read the fine print. Report suspicious claims to the authorities. There are, in fact, authorities. Here are some of them that you could contact. If you find something that really seems egregious and might be damaging, well, you can report that to the Federal Trade Commission, Better Business Bureau, or even your state attorney general's office. And that's probably a great thing to do. Good practices there. So maybe that can help you slog through those internet resources. And I think that just looking over this list, you should be pretty equipped to do that and help others, including your parents and grandparents, do the same. Now, as this is a health communication class, we would be remiss to not talk about the other side of this equation, which would be providers. And how useful is this information for providers? I was going to put together a pros and cons, but it's a lot of the same. Mostly, providers don't like it. They're usually skeptical of new technology, and for good reason. And so here are some of those good reasons. The advantages are likely the same, right? It can potentially streamline things. It can hopefully make patients better equipped and improve their health literacy, reduce costs, all that stuff. You can use your imagination there, but it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, about half of new eHealth programs fail. So naturally, physicians tend to be a little skeptical of those kinds of things. They tend to be expensive. They tend to be hard to adopt or integrate into existing systems, right? Whether that's a learning curve of using the technology or whether it's just we can't get it to sync up with all our existing medical records. There's also this idea of interoperability in terms of operating systems. So just basic logistics of computers. Why can't we get this thing to work with our old operating system? Again, that probably falls into that category of integrating and adopting new technology. We also have the potential for harming patient-provider relationships, and we definitely don't want to do that. So if the eHealth initiative is going to decrease face time, well, that's a concern, but it could also reduce trust in those providers if it introduces delays and costs and things like that. There's also the number one, probably this could be right at the top of the list, is design and usability of the interfaces. So if it's not aesthetically pleasing, if it's not easy to use, that is a problem as well. Might be a good time for you to stretch your memory back to designing health communication campaigns and the paths of persuasion, whether it's heuristic cues or the central root of persuasion, whether it's something aesthetic and credible or whether it is good information. The best thing to do is have parallel processing and make it easy to access. Well, same thing applies to things like eHealth. If it's a really ugly interface and it's hard to use, well, guess what? No one's going to use it. Now, overall, the biggest thing is if you're going to introduce new technology, you'd really like it to make your life easier. And the sad truth is a lot of the time it doesn't. It might make more work for physicians, more work for administrators, and more work for patients. And that's really not ideal. So what is the overall impact of eHealth? Well, ultimately, it probably depends on things like uses and gratifications. Sorry, here's yet another theory, but this is going all the way back to 1974, thinking about just how people adopt new technology. And that is recognizing the fact that people are not passive receivers of technology and mediated messages. Again, when we say mediated messages, think of the common root word there of media. Often we're talking about computer-mediated messages or technology-mediated messages, something like that. But that's what we're talking about with eHealth, right? People are not passive receivers of mediated messages in general, and this is no different when it comes to eHealth. This means that people pursue and engage media use when and if it satisfies some kind of need for them. Pretty straightforward. What are those needs? Well, a need for information, a need for cognitive exercise, social stimulation, escape from whatever it is, your day-to-day life even, or entertainment, or some other need. So if there's no need for the media, guess what? People aren't going to use it. They're not going to adopt it, and it's going to make their lives harder. But uses and gratifications can help us just have a very baseline understanding of what's going to happen or what we can expect to happen. It helps us meet those realistic criteria that we've outlined in the past for objectives and goals. So now that we've talked about eHealth, probably the most pressing and relevant thing for you is mHealth, which is standing for mobile health. And rather than go through all the different health apps or whatever, that's not really what we're here to do. Furthermore, this is we're talking about emerging contexts. Well, this is fairly emerging. We still don't know exactly what the implications of these things are, but we can draw lessons from the other examples, and it probably applies the same way here. But as a reminder, smart devices are the main thing that we're talking about with mHealth. And they tend to open up new possibilities for health and healthcare well above and beyond existing eHealth options. So if individualized care is the goal, our mobile devices are part of that, whether it's accessing patient portals or monitoring our own health. The textbook uses the examples of Apple Watches or smartwatches or Fitbits to give us this insight into our ongoing health rather than just like feeling our heartbeat. These kinds of devices can help us identify problems that we may not be aware of. Heart palpitations while you sleep, well, you may not know about that, but if your smartwatch says, hey, you had a really high heart rate while you slept last night, that can be helpful to get you an intervention. That was one example the textbook used. So we can see that that's an important part of this. But there is also an additional ethical consideration. And I think that this is a really important question to ask, and we all have to answer it individually, but it would be helpful if we consider it rather than be passive receivers or at worst victims of these kinds of things, because these companies are pushing in certain directions, and that is to know more about you. And part of that's for your benefit, but it's probably also for theirs too. So we have to ask ourselves, do we really want Google to know all of our biometrics, our genetic history, our geographic location at all times? Uh, well, we all have different opinions about that, but we do know that Google is the biggest ad company in the history of humankind, the most successful one as well. And they just bought Fitbit this past year as of the recording of this video. Well, that might be grounds for concern. Um, it might be fairly benign, but even benign intentions can have undesirable consequences for people on the receiving end. So on the one hand, this is giving us more insight into ourselves and our bodies. On the other hand, it's giving other people more insight into ourselves and our bodies. And we have to kind of weigh that ethically as to whether or not we're comfortable with that. I don't have a clean answer for you. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable for the same reason that I think informed consent is really important. I think that people should be active participants in their own health, but they should be aware of what is happening around them, what is happening with their health information, and under no circumstances should our health information be used against us. And that's something that we are going to have to actively guard against as we go forward. That leads me to kind of conclusions of this lecture, to consider telehealth a little bit. But telehealth and patient portals, well, it's good and bad as usual. Again, I don't feel the need to go through every single part of this, as the same lessons apply from eHealth in general. You can and should read the whole chapter in the textbook to make sure that you understand how these things work. There are limitations to things. Patient portals, well, there's the potential to streamline everything and cut costs, and that's great. I like patient portals. As someone with a chronic health condition, I find it very useful to be able to communicate with my doctors without having to go through a bunch of phone calls and holds and wait times and play phone tag with the doctor. It's nice to be able to do things like message my doctor and check my test results and do things like that online. So that can be really useful. However, on the other side, there are plenty of bad, unusable, hard to use patient portals that are not well integrated, not very streamlined. And again, considering those advantages and disadvantages and all these behavioral influences of people and their decision making and information seeking behaviors, well, you better make sure that that patient portal is actually going to streamline things and cut costs. We can't just introduce these tools and expect them to work on their own. Again, going back to our original themes, that's not how new tools work. We use them. They don't immediately and magically, they're not just innately useful unless we use them, because they are our tools and we are tool users. One without the other is kind of meaningless. So, that's kind of an overarching theme here. I hope you found that useful. So these things need to be easy to use. They need to benefit us, and that's about it.